Tsar Bomb, the most destructive weapon ever tested on Earth. A hydrogen bomb exploded on October 30, 1961 in the Arctic region of the Soviet Union. 1 year later, almost to the day, a standoff between the United States and Soviet Union over the presence of missiles on the island of Cuba could have unleashed a direct confrontation between the two nuclear-armed superpowers. My name is John Bodden. I'm a professor of history with a research focus on the Cold War in Latin America. Normally I publish videos about baseball to this channel, but in this lecture I'm going to provide an outline of what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, capture the perspective of its protagonists, discuss the conflict's resolution, its consequences, and show how things could have turned out differently. At the end, I'll reflect on what lessons I believe we can draw from this almost nuclear war. But first, a bit of context. Why did these Soviet ballistic missiles wind up in Cuba in the first place? To make sense of things, you have to know that Cuba was a colony of Spain in the 19th century. Patriots launched a war for independence in 1895. At the outset, rebel armies won a series of battles and fought the Spanish army to a standstill for 3 long years. But Imperial Spain showed no signs of backing down. Madrid dispatched General Valeriano Weyler to control the island, and he made use of concentration camps, executions, and mass exile to deal with the insurgents. Then the United States intervened in the conflict, and events moved very quickly after that. Washington declared war on Spain in April 1898, and Commodore George Dewey sunk the Spanish Pacific Fleet in the Philippines during the month of May. U.S. ground forces landed in eastern Cuba, and Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders won the Battle of San Juan Hill in early July. Not long after, the U.S. Navy sunk the Spanish fleet at the Battle of Santiago Bay. However, Spain did not surrender to the Cuban people or their generals. Spain surrendered to the United States and negotiated directly with Washington. Ultimately, the U.S. Army occupied the island for 3 years before Cuba's first government accepted the Platt Amendment, which gave control over Cuba's foreign affairs to the United States Senate until 1933. Cuba's leaders also had to authorize a permanent lease to the U.S. Navy for a base at Guantanamo Bay on the eastern side of the island. Notwithstanding the admiration Cubans could have for the United States, it's important to know that the history of Spanish and then U.S. imperialism forged strong nationalist feelings on the island. Cuba belongs to us, not to you. And to this day, the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay symbolizes the country's unequal relationship. In the aftermath of the Second World War's destruction, the Soviet Union and the United States found themselves locked in a Cold War struggle. This great geopolitical competition is not the subject of my lecture, so I won't enter into a discussion of its origins. What I will say is that the two superpowers wanted to show the superiority of their social and economic systems, and they competed for influence across the developing world. Dozens of countries were becoming independent nations after 1945, and they needed arms, capital, and technical assistance. So that's important to know. And from one perspective, Cuba was not yet an independent country, but rather locked in a neo-colonial relationship with the United States. During the 1950s, a Cuban dictator named Fulgencio Batista ruled the country with an iron fist and enjoyed, at least initially, U.S. support for his anti-communism. However, Batista's corrupt and abusive rule engendered a fierce domestic opposition from many quarters. Notably, a group of revolutionaries led by the charismatic Fidel Castro initiated a guerrilla movement in the eastern mountains. Against incredible odds, Castro's guerrilla army grew in strength and captured cities. Batista fled the island, and Castro arrived in Havana in January 1959, hailed as a hero and liberator. Well, over the next year, Castro swiftly consolidated his power through a combination of shrewd political maneuvering and ruthlessness. He put his brother Raul, a known communist, in charge of the military, and Che Guevara, another avowed Marxist, in charge of the nation's agrarian reform. Castro killed or jailed anti-communist rivals, and then nationalized U.S.-owned properties. The deterioration of U.S.-Cuban relations put the two governments on a collision course. The United States regarded the increasingly radical revolution as unacceptable and began planning for a U.S.-sponsored overthrow of the young revolutionaries. Castro's timing for confronting the United States could not have been better. The Soviet Union's premier, Nikita Khrushchev, was feeling confident after the launch of Sputnik in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's successful orbit of Earth in 1961. To young revolutionaries such as Fidel Castro, the socialist Soviet Union looked like the future, not a state that would disintegrate 30 years later. Of even greater importance was the wider socialist world. China and the USSR disagreed on key issues and actively competed for the hearts and minds of smaller countries in the socialist camp. Both Khrushchev and Chinese Premier Mao Zedong wanted Cuba's friendship, and so the worsening Sino-Soviet competition benefited Castro's revolution. Mao sent substantial aid to the island, despite his own nation's poverty. But the Soviets clearly had more to offer. Nikita Khrushchev could meet Cuba's energy needs, buy Cuban sugar at above-market prices, and could deliver advanced weaponry to the newly established Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba. For its part, the Soviet Union got a foothold in the Caribbean and positive PR as a defender of a socialist third world nation. Cuba's geopolitical significance soared, and it wasn't just the United States that worried about Cuba. Latin American governments generally opposed the Soviet-Cuban alliance, especially since Cuba actively supported radical revolutions across the region. In March 1960, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to begin organizing Cuban dissidents for an invasion of Cuba, with the purpose of overthrowing Castro. 9 months later, in January 1961, he broke diplomatic relations. That takes us to John F. Kennedy. The newly elected American president inherited U.S. preparation for an armed action against Castro. JFK decided to authorize the landing of 1,200 Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the United States government at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. Their goal was to overthrow Castro. Crucially, the CIA assured the White House that the exiles would be greeted as liberators and face little resistance from poorly motivated regional militias. In truth, Castro's government enjoyed a strong base of support, and Raul Castro's system of regional militias fought to defend the revolutionary state. Additionally, Soviet battle tanks had arrived just in time for their effective use by the regular army on the field of battle. Within 72 hours, Cuba's armed forces had killed or captured all of the U.S.-backed invaders, although not without substantial casualties and fierce fighting. To say this was a defeat for John F. Kennedy is an understatement. Castro's forces had, in effect, defeated the United States government. In Moscow, Khrushchev saw the Bay of Pigs fiasco as a sign of JFK's incompetence. Khrushchev sent Kennedy a telegram that denounced what he called armed aggression against the free people. Kennedy replied that the U.S. was on the side of freedom and self-determination because Castro was a dictator unwilling to hold elections. During the summer, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy met in Vienna for a summit where they discussed the city of Berlin and the continued presence of Western troops there. Cuba didn't come up directly, but it was on each man's mind. Kennedy wanted Castro overthrown. Khrushchev wanted Castro safe. Various matters went unresolved, and East Germany's government built a wall to seal off East Berlin from West Berlin not long after the summit. The Cold War competition showed no signs of détente. Let's talk for a moment about the leaders of the United States and Soviet Union. What do we need to know about Khrushchev and Kennedy? On the one hand, they were products of very different environments. Khrushchev came from a humble peasant family. Kennedy grew up rich in New England. One was a Bolshevik revolutionary. The other went to Harvard University. On the other hand, they had something important in common. Both were veterans of World War II. They had witnessed the horrors of war. Kennedy on a torpedo boat destroyed by the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean, and Khrushchev during the Soviet defense of Kiev and Stalingrad. Both men understood the unpredictability of war and its wastefulness. What I mean to say is that the two most powerful men in the world were not trigger-happy cowboys. They were adversaries locked in a competition for global influence and power, but not irrational madmen. Kennedy regarded the very existence of revolutionary Cuba as a menace to the region and a threat to American prestige. Khrushchev wanted a foothold in the Americas, and wouldn't it be nice if the Soviets had a submarine base in the Caribbean? For their part, John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, pictured right, felt humiliated by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. They resolved to eliminate Castro. Robert Kennedy personally oversaw Operation Mongoose, a covert operation that attacked Cuba from within and without. Nothing was off the table, including assassination attempts. The Kennedy brothers never questioned for a minute whether or not it was wrong to murder this nearby head of state. Fidel Castro, for his part, knew the most powerful man in the world, John F. Kennedy, wanted him dead. Brothers Fidel and Raul knew the United States would never accept the radical nature of their revolution. They were also aware of the extent to which the United States had engaged in sabotage and terrorism on the island. Cuba needed powerful friends, and the USSR was the most obvious ally capable of protecting the Cuban Revolution. What do we need to know about Cuba's leadership? Well, they were men of action who understood the meaning of courage and sacrifice. They resolved never to accept a resumption of the old U.S.-Cuba relationship, in which the United States dominated the island. They were also more idealistic and less mature than Kennedy and Khrushchev. Che Guevara, pictured right of Castro, believed in global revolution and the imperative of spreading Marxist revolution worldwide. In short, these 30-something bearded guys were young, determined, and inflexible. Let's talk a bit more about Khrushchev's global concerns. I mentioned that he was vying with Mao Zedong for leadership of the socialist world. In Europe, Britain had its own nuclear arsenal, and Dwight Eisenhower had deployed nuclear-armed Jupiter missiles to Italy and Turkey, both NATO allies. Khrushchev didn't like that. He felt surrounded. Turkey bordered the USSR. So Khrushchev is thinking, if the USA can point missiles at Moscow from Turkey, I should be able to point missiles at the USA from Cuba. Medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba would equalize his position with Kennedy. So he contacted the Cubans for approval and authorized a plan to bring Soviet missiles onto the island. It was bold, it was risky, and it was provocative. Operation Anadyr involved a large-scale secret military deployment of weapons that included not just strategic nuclear missiles, but some 40,000 Soviet military personnel, 2 anti-aircraft divisions, 12 missile boats, 6 jet bombers, and short-range artillery rocket systems. Apart from the ballistic missiles, large quantities of military equipment and troops would arrive to protect Soviet installations and deter a possible U.S. invasion. Not everyone in the Politburo, the Soviet highest decision-making body, thought Khrushchev's secret operation made sense, given that American spy planes regularly flew over Cuba. The U.S. intelligence community might discover what was happening and react strongly. Besides, there was a tremendous distance separating Cuba and the Soviet Union. So why did Khrushchev undertake such a risky move? 3 reasons stand out to me. First, Khrushchev wanted Soviet missiles closer to the United States. Second, he wanted to protect the Cuban Revolution. And third, he thought he could get away with it. Either JFK would back down or he could negotiate advantageously if the missile sites were detected. For their part, American intelligence officers knew large shipments of Soviet weaponry, tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft guns, were arriving to Cuba, but they presumed the deliveries were defensive in nature. Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrin, pictured left, publicly assured the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, that no offensive weapons were being delivered to Cuba in September 1962. By this point, the Soviet military was in the middle of building launch sites and rapidly advancing towards a point when the systems would be fully operational. Why did this massive covert operation escape U.S. intelligence for so long? Well, first, JFK wanted to avoid international incidents, and so during the summer he did not authorize low-flying aerial reconnaissance of Soviet cargo ships bound for Cuba. Second, the Soviets had never deployed weapons of mass destruction outside of their own borders. The American intelligence community did not think they were likely to do so and risk a U.S. military response. One person, however, thought differently. CIA Director John McCone urged Kennedy to conduct aerial surveillance of the island due to the presence of anti-aircraft surface-to-air missiles. That seemed like evidence of a plan to protect strategic weaponry. On McCone's advice, Kennedy authorized a reconnaissance flight over Cuba. On October 14th, a high-altitude U-2 jet took this photograph for the CIA. What it revealed was clear. The Soviets were building missile launch sites. Khrushchev had deceived Kennedy. Faced with this startling information, JFK formed an executive committee to consider what course of action to take. The committee, which included cabinet members and high-ranking military officers, considered how to respond. Do nothing, bomb the missile sites, launch a ground invasion, blockade the island. Kennedy, to his credit, allowed committee members to speak their minds openly and disagree with him. General Curtis LeMay of the Strategic Air Command and General Maxwell Taylor of the Joint Chiefs urged him to resolve the crisis with force. But John F. Kennedy was skeptical of military action. He hoped for and preferred a diplomatic solution. Khrushchev, by contrast, made decisions in isolation from such a democratic environment. He did discuss matters of state with his Central Committee, but few members would dare to challenge him. In the United States, Soviet ambassadors to the United States and United Nations, Anatoly Dobrin and Valerian Zorin, did not know about the offensive weapons in Cuba because Khrushchev kept both men in the dark about the operation. Secrecy defined the Kremlin's modus operandi. After extensive deliberations, the White House announced that the president would address the nation on a matter of the highest national urgency. On Monday, October 22nd, in the evening, American television networks interrupted normally scheduled programs. Kennedy publicly discussed evidence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, weapons capable of reaching New York and Washington, D.C., as well as targets in Latin America, such as the Panama Canal. Kennedy spoke of Soviet lies and dissimulation, and then announced what his government would do.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
That line, a full retaliatory response, is chilling because it means annihilation. Millions of people vaporized. Those words unsettled people around the world. What JFK called a strict quarantine was a blockade, and it set up a showdown. Soviet ships heading towards Cuba would eventually encounter the U.S. Navy. On October 23rd, JFK authorized low-altitude reconnaissance flights over Cuba. On October 24th, the U.S. Navy went into position with orders to enforce the blockade. Entirely unclear was how Soviet commanders would react if intercepted by the U.S. Navy. And the executive committee deliberated on this matter. What might happen? How would inspections occur? What about Soviet submarines? How would they be forced to surface and stay away from Cuba? Khrushchev responded indignantly. You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you are saying. And you want to persuade me to agree to this? What would it mean to agree to these demands? On October 24th, the U.S. Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2, or the state of readiness before an actual nuclear strike, DEFCON 1. Well, DEFCON 2 got Khrushchev's attention. He did not initiate the same level of readiness in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev knew the Americans could strike him first and without warning. At this point in the crisis, American planes violated Cuban airspace regularly. And what's important to know here is that Cubans viewed these flights not just as violations of their sovereignty, but as precursors to a ground invasion. In Cuba, Soviet troops guarding newly established military installations could see and hear the U-2s, or high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft used by the U.S. government for intelligence gathering. Flying at 70,000 feet meant they could not be intercepted by Soviet MiG fighter jets, but they were vulnerable to Soviet surface-to-air missiles. Some Soviet officers on the ground grumbled, "We're here to protect Cuba and our missile sites, aren't we? We should shoot down those treacherous spy planes the imperialists have sent." Kennedy and his executive committee had very little idea how jittery the overflights were making their communist adversaries. During the entire missile crisis, U.S. naval planes buzzed over Soviet ships and monitored their movements. And what if Moscow couldn't effectively communicate with its fleet commanders, sending, for instance, an order to turn around? This was a pre-internet era. Communications took much longer. For instance, formal diplomatic messages in Russian took time to arrive in Washington and be properly translated. On October 25th, the Americans began actively enforcing the blockade. Notably, the USS Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. intercepted and boarded a Lebanese freighter on October 26th. U.S. troops inspected the ship, and it was cleared to continue. The same day, 14 Soviet ships turned around or altered course. You might say Khrushchev blinked. What was happening scared him. On October 26th, he wrote an emotional and long-winded message to Kennedy. It lectured him on the socialist world's desire for peace and the Soviet desire to protect Cuba. However, it proposed a deal. The USSR would pull its offensive weapons, and the U.S. would have to promise not to invade Cuba. Meanwhile, on the same day, October 26th, Castro wrote to Khrushchev with the news that he expected an American invasion at some point within the next 24 to 72 hours. Stunningly, he urged Khrushchev to strike first, before an invasion of Cuba could even occur. Leaders in Cuba were not going to back down one iota from a confrontation. They were ready to resist a ground invasion as well as sacrifice the entire Cuban people on the altar of revolutionary martyrdom. Saturday, October 27th, has been called Black Saturday because so many events occurred at once that made the situation exceptionally dangerous and unpredictable. On October 27th, Radio Moscow broadcast a second message from Khrushchev. This message differed from the first. It publicly proposed a missile swap. The U.S. would take its missiles out of Turkey, and Italy in exchange for Soviet rockets coming out of Cuba. The American Executive Committee asked why the message differed from Khrushchev's first. Could it even be trusted? Several members of the committee feared accepting the deal would cause them to lose credibility with NATO allies. The Turks, in particular, did not want to give up their missile system. Meanwhile, something very disturbing occurred. Word reached the Executive Committee that a Soviet surface-to-air missile had brought down an American U-2. The pilot, Rudolf Anderson, had died. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries had also fired on low-flying U.S. reconnaissance aircraft. From one point of view, the Soviets had committed an act of war. But Kennedy, to his credit, did not retaliate. Khrushchev, on hearing the news of the U-2 incident, could see that he was losing control of events. He had already issued an order that no American planes were to be shot down, but ground commanders did so anyway based on their view of the situation and its imperatives. Robert F. Kennedy communicated to Anatoly Dobrin that their side had drawn first blood. Airstrikes and invasion would follow a second incident. JFK was open to Khrushchev's proposed missile swap, but JFK's advisors, especially Generals LeMay and Maxwell, wanted an invasion of Cuba. Act, Mr. President. Meanwhile, another American U-2 pilot, Charles Maltzby, had mistakenly strayed into Soviet territory. Were the Americans preparing for an attack? What did this mean? Asked Soviet officials. Unknown to either the Soviet or American leadership, the most dangerous incident of Black Saturday was about to occur when parts of the American fleet discovered a B-59 Soviet diesel submarine moving through international waters. The USS Randolph, an aircraft carrier supported by 11 American destroyers, pursued the sub in a cat-and-mouse game and started dropping signaling depth charges, small explosive devices about the size of a grenade, on top of the Soviet submarine. Wait, why would they do that? Couldn't this be misinterpreted? Earlier in the week, U.S. officials had deliberated on how to intercept Soviet subs. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara came up with a plan that was authorized by JFK. The Navy crews would drop practice depth charges as a signal for Soviet subs to surface, alongside the proviso that Soviet commanders in Moscow should be informed by Washington of what the U.S. Navy was doing. What could go wrong? Well, the plan assumed Soviet admirals would communicate with their subordinates, something that didn't happen, and that Soviet submarine crews would understand the meaning of these explosions. I should mention something else important. Soviet submarine captains had authorization to retaliate if attacked, and they possessed nuclear torpedoes. What was it like for Soviet crews underwater in the Caribbean? Well, they were 6,000 miles from home, out of radio contact with Moscow, exhausted, and working in cramped conditions with a temperature above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sailors passed out from the heat and dehydration as loud, repeated explosions rocked the hull and created confusion. What was going on? Was there a war underway? Amid this uncertainty, the sub had to surface for air and to recharge its batteries. Surrounded by the U.S. Navy, it was nighttime, and U.S. crews immediately trained bright searchlights on the sub's bridge and watched Soviet sailors breathing desperately needed fresh air. Meanwhile, an amped-up U.S. pilot shot tracer bullets ahead of the Soviet sub. Then an American naval plane, a P-2V Neptune, dropped photo flash bombs to aid nighttime aerial photography. Blinding white lights flashed across the sky. Now imagine you're the Soviet captain witnessing all of this. Why are they shooting? Why have they been bombing us? Has the war begun? The stressful situation convinced the sub's captain, Valentin Savitsky, to issue an order. Ready the special weapon or nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, a cooler head was present. Commander Vasily Arkhipov, sometimes called the man who saved the world, stayed on the bridge and received signal flashes from the U.S. Navy apologizing for the gunfire. Arkhipov calmed down Savitsky and diffused the tense situation. Let's pause for a moment. What's plain from this event in the Atlantic Ocean is that a slightly different sequence of events and a slightly different set of actions could have produced different outcomes. In retrospect, we can see how the Soviet B-59 sub could have launched its nuclear torpedo and destroyed the USS Randolph. Back in Washington, JFK authorized his brother to negotiate a secret missile swap with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrin. Publicly, JFK replied to Khrushchev's first message, not his second. Yes, we will promise not to invade Cuba so long as you withdraw your missiles from the island. Secretly, JFK promised to remove Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey. At this point in the crisis, no one knew what was going to happen. The Americans were preparing for a ground invasion of Cuba on Tuesday, with Soviet commanders shoot down another American plane, and 3 Soviet subs were being hunted by the U.S. Navy. And then it came. On October 28th, Khrushchev accepted JFK's terms. The Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would pledge not to invade the island. Khrushchev did not consult the Politburo. The prospect of thermonuclear war scared him. He wanted the crisis resolved immediately. Iconic revolutionary Che Guevara said of what had happened, "We were perhaps a millimeter away from an atomic catastrophe." I mention this quote by Che because subsequent revelations would show just how few millimeters separate the crisis from atomic catastrophe. In 1962, the participants didn't fully realize all of the different ways it could have gone wrong. What was the view of the outcome in Washington? In short, it was one of triumph. The Soviets had backed down, we had stood up to a bully. And from one perspective, it was our willingness to wage war that made possible the conflict's peaceful resolution. Robert Kennedy's book, 13 Days, solidified that view of American resolve and rational, democratic decision-making in contrast to the secrecy and despotism of Khrushchev. There's even a Hollywood film by the same name which reinforces this narrative. What historians have come to realize since the 1990s is just how much JFK did not know during the crisis. First, there were 42,000 Soviet military personnel stationed in Cuba, not 5,000. Second, there were 100 tactical nuclear warheads still on the island in November. The Americans had no idea of their existence. Third, Soviet submarine commanders possessed nuclear-tipped torpedoes and provisional authority to use them. Fourth, Soviet ground commanders in Cuba had tactical nukes and provisional authority to use them in the event of a U.S. invasion. What was the view in Moscow? Well, Soviet propaganda cast the event as a victory for international socialism because the Americans had pledged not to invade Cuba. At the same time, it was clearly a defeat for Khrushchev. The Soviet military had been forced to pack up the newly installed missiles and undergo visual inspection of their cargoes while traveling home. The political fallout continued for years. In 1964, members of the Soviet Politburo removed Khrushchev from power, citing the fact that he had created a dangerous crisis in the Caribbean and then backed down from the danger. What was the view of things in Havana? In short, Cuba's leaders felt humiliated, like they had had zero importance during the conflict's resolution. Khrushchev did not consult them during his secret deal-making with Kennedy, and they first heard the news of it on the radio. Besides, what reason did they have to believe that the United States would honor its pledge not to invade the island? The Soviet Union had a second crisis to deal with in November 1962. Khrushchev dispatched Politburo member Anadyr Mikoyan, pictured left, to Washington and Havana. His job? Meet all of the key parties and close the deal the Soviets had made with the Americans. In Havana, he received a chilly reception because the Cubans felt totally betrayed. Castro refused to allow UN inspectors onto Cuban territory, which complicated Mikoyan's efforts to end the American blockade. Mikoyan also informed Castro that in addition to the strategic weapons, Soviet bombers and tactical nukes were going back to Russia. You can imagine how members of the Cuban military felt. They're taking away our bombers. They're taking away our nukes. We thought all of this weaponry was going to be permanent and under our control, so we can defend ourselves. Mikoyan, I might add, decided during his visit to Havana that the young, hot-tempered Castro could not be trusted with tactical nukes, so he cited a fictitious law requiring their removal. During the crisis, Fidel Castro boldly announced his 5 demands. He wanted an end to the U.S. economic embargo of Cuba, no further violations of Cuban airspace, an end to U.S. subversive activities against Cuba, and that Americans should end their occupation of the Guantanamo naval base. None of his demands were met. As Thucydides wrote, The powerful exact what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. What about the role of the world's largest intergovernmental organization? Well, most members of the United Nations, 110 voting members, wanted peace. And the UN's General Secretary, U Thant, did his best to facilitate negotiations between the Soviet Union and the United States and to de-escalate the situation. But ultimately, the United Nations couldn't stop the superpowers from shooting strategic missiles at each other, poisoning the earth and unleashing untold damage. Two men from different countries would decide the fate of millions. And even in the USSR and USA, there was a feeling of powerlessness. What could an ordinary person do but watch the crisis unfold and pray? The Cuban Missile Crisis had several important consequences for the world system. With respect to the Cold War, the Soviet Union and United States developed a more stable relationship marked by less brinkmanship. Notably, Moscow and Washington established a direct hotline to aid swifter communication. In 1963, the USA, USSR, and UK signed a treaty banning nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Today, 123 states have ratified the treaty, shown here in green. In the coming years, American policymakers resolved to push back on Soviet influence elsewhere in the world. Notably, they stepped up the U.S. commitment to South Vietnam. Soviet policymakers, by contrast, resolved to be more cautious in Latin America. They did not want to risk another crisis in a region they didn't understand. We can also say the crisis generated the international will needed to ban nuclear weapons. In 1967, 14 Latin American countries agreed to prohibit the testing, use, storage, installation, or deployment of nuclear weapons. Other countries, those in blue, have followed Latin America's lead and belong to nuclear-free zones. How do scholars interpret the crisis? Here I want to mention 3 recently published books. Martin Sherwin's Gambling with Armageddon introduced the idea of the long Cuban Missile Crisis, a global event and pivotal moment in the Cold War, but also a crisis that represented the culmination of a nuclear arms race that began in 1945 and continued over the next 17 years with an incredibly high degree of brinksmanship, danger, and confrontation. The standoff over Cuba marked the start of a new, more stable relationship between the superpowers. Sherwin's book is noteworthy for its emphasis on luck, in that Kennedy and Khrushchev may have wanted to avoid war, but they often had limited control over faraway commanders who possessed provisional authority to spark an unwanted military confrontation. Avoiding a nuclear war may depend on the judgment of the national leaders, but avoiding war also depends on minimizing the errors and missteps of others. Theodore Voorhees takes almost the exact opposite position in The Silent Guns of Two Octobers. Voorhees observes that Kennedy and Khrushchev made major concessions to keep the peace in Berlin and Cuba because they wanted peace, not war. Sure, the two leaders might engage in brinksmanship and rhetoric that terrified the global public, but they had a sober view of nuclear war and what it meant, and they would have never gone so far as to allow their soldiers to shoot at each other. To resolve international crises in 1961 and 1962, they relied on back-channel diplomacy outside of the public's eye. Voorhees emphasizes the rationality of Kennedy and Khrushchev. In my view, Voorhees greatly downplays events and circumstances in which the risk of inadvertent nuclear war was far greater than anyone realized. Sergei Plokhy's book, Nuclear Folly, emphasizes the immense stress, confusion, and uncertainty of the missile crisis. Plokhy examines the backgrounds of JFK and Khrushchev, their experiences in World War II, and their mutual fear of nuclear war. He puts an accent on what Americans did not know in 1962, and especially the delayed exchanges of information to the Kremlin and White House. In his view, those delays are what made the crisis so dangerous. Plokhy writes, "The two adversaries had indeed met eyeball to eyeball in the Caribbean, and one of them had blinked first. The problem was they could hardly see each other's eyes, to say nothing of eyeballs. A dark room of deception and mutual suspicion was made even darker by the lack of reliable and timely information, and when one side blinked, it took the other side more than a day to realize what had happened. The nuclear age preceded the arrival of the information age by at least a few decades. In October 1962, that gap might very well have led to the return of the Stone Age. Let's talk about the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What does it teach us today in the 21st century? Well, here are 4 lessons. Deception and mistrust make crises more difficult to navigate. Rival states often lack accurate information about each other. The psychology of leaders and nations matter. And luck matters. The world got lucky in 1962. The American biologist E.O. Wilson said, "The real problem with humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." I think that's right. The Cuban Missile Crisis puts into relief the conundrum posed by Wilson. Our psyche hasn't changed. We have the same emotions of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and yet we possess the ability to destroy ourselves. With hindsight, some things are clear. For instance, a full-scale ground assault of Cuba by the American military would have resulted in retaliation, and Soviet ground commanders had tactical nukes. In the movie Contact, starring Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey, Foster's character is asked by an international panel what questions she would ask extraterrestrial life forms were she given the chance to meet them. Here is her answer.
If you should meet these vegans and were permitted only one question to ask of them, what would it be?
Well, I suppose it would be, how did you do it? How did you evolve? How did you survive this technological adolescence without destroying yourself? That, more than any other question, is the one that I personally would like to have answered.
60 years ago, the most dangerous moment in human history scared the world and created the will for international agreements limiting the pace of nuclear proliferation. Russia and the United States no longer threaten each other with mutually assured destruction, but authoritarian governments have not gone away, and more significantly, 9 countries with nuclear weapons are run by fallible human beings who can overreact or miscommunicate during a crisis. We should remember the world's almost nuclear war in 1962 and be humbled by it.